For as long as we've told stories, we've told them about witches. The healer at the edge of the village. The woman blamed when the cattle got sick or when the harvest failed. Witches were said to curse, to blight, to call down ruin with nothing more than a muttered word. And though the witch trials ended long ago, their shadows linger. Even today, in lonely valleys and weather-worn farmhouses, there are places where people whisper that something has been left behind. One of those places lies in the hills of Wales, a stone house called Heol Fanog. To most, it's just another farmhouse. But to the family who lived there in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it became a prison of dread. They described footsteps in empty rooms, objects flying across the air. A silent old woman who stood in the corner of the playroom, so constant the children thought she belonged there. Their animals died, their bills soared to impossible heights, and every attempt to cleanse the house only seemed to stir the darkness further. The locals began to call it something else, the witch farm. In the late 1980s, a young family moved into a weather-beaten stone farmhouse tucked into the hills above Brecon in Wales. The place was called Heol Fanog. To the casual eye, it looked like so many rural homes, solid, rugged, surrounded by fields that rolled toward the Brecon Beacons. For Bill and Liz Rich, it promised a new start. Bill was an artist. He wanted space, light, and isolation to work. Liz wanted a family home, a retreat from the bustle of town life. But Heol Fanog was not just another farmhouse. From the very first weeks, it carried with it an unease, a tension, as if something about the building resented the family's arrival. The first incident was simple: footsteps. Heavy, hobnailed footsteps echoing across the floorboards overhead when every member of the family was together in one room. Bill froze, listening, waiting for someone to appear. But no one came. And when he checked, the rooms were empty. Soon after came the smells, strange, pungent odors seeping through the rooms with no source. Then the movements, paintbrushes flying from his studio, objects toppling when nobody was near. The Riches laughed it off at first. Old houses creak, they said. Strange smells rise from damp walls. But deep down, the mood was already changing. What makes Heol Fanog different from most haunted houses is how the disturbances quickly bled into everyday life in ways that couldn't be shrugged off. It began with the bills. Electricity bills so large they seemed impossible. £750 for a single quarter, then another for over 500. For a rural family in the late 1980s, it was devastating. And there was no explanation. Appliances were off, lights were unused. Even the power company's own inspectors saw the meter wheels spinning wildly when the house was silent. A solicitor became involved. Letters were exchanged. And for a time, the company stopped sending bills altogether because there was simply no rational account for what was happening. It is here that the story begins to take on the shape of something older. In centuries past, witches were blamed for exactly this kind of creeping ruin: milk souring overnight, crops failing, livestock dying, and families reduced to poverty, by an unseen hand. The idea of a witch's curse was how rural communities explained the slow drain of life and fortune from a household. And so, even in the 20th century, the riches found themselves reliving those old fears. Their farmhouse wasn't simply haunted by creaks and shadows. It was as if the land itself had turned against them, draining them in the way villagers once swore a witch could do. Then came the apparition. The rich children began speaking of a woman in their playroom. She stood silently in the corner, always present, never speaking, and never moving. To them, she was not strange. She was simply there. The children thought everyone saw her, but Bill and Liz did not. It was only later, after others began reporting figures and shapes in the house, that Liz came to believe this silent figure was real, the ghost of an old woman tied to the farm. To neighbors and later investigators, the image of the crone in the corner struck a chord. In rural lore, witches were often imagined as older women, silent, watchful, and dangerous. Whether this figure was a ghost or a vision, it became central to the story of Heol Fanog. She was not just an apparition, she was an archetype, the witch in the room. And the house itself seemed determined to echo her presence. As the weeks turned into months, other phenomena emerged. Bangs in empty corridors, doors slamming, a sense of hostility that settled on anyone who stayed too long. The atmosphere grew oppressive. Visitors described feeling drained, uneasy, and watched. Each thread of the haunting seemed to connect back to the same picture, a family besieged by forces that mirrored the old accusations of witchcraft. Things went missing, and more energy was consumed without use. Animals and people got sick more than usual. And always, at the edges, the silent figure of a woman, a witch, or something very much like one. The riches had wanted an escape, a refuge in the hills. Instead, they had stepped into a story centuries old, one that echoed the darkest folklore of Wales. The farmhouse at Heol Fanog was not just a home. It was becoming a modern legend, known now as the Witch Farm. As the months at Heol Fanog wore on, the disturbances grew bolder. What had begun with footsteps and flickering lights became a pattern of relentless oppression. The electricity drain never stopped. Day after day, the meter ticked over at a rate that stunned the utility company. Bills mounted into the hundreds and then more, crushing the family's finances. Inspectors came, shrugged, and left baffled. They confirmed the impossible. The current was flowing when nothing was drawing it. For the riches, it was as if the house itself was feeding, leeching from them in secret. The curse is never quick. It is slow, persistent, gnawing away at strength until nothing remains. And that was exactly what Heol Fanog was doing. It began with small things, the cats first, slipping away one by one. Liz would call for them in the evenings, her voice carrying down the lane, but they never came back. Then the goats grew uneasy. They shied from the barn door, their eyes rolling white, their bodies tense at nothing Bill could see. And then one morning, the stillness broke. The air outside was cool, clean, that thin, glassy kind of light that comes before the sun really lifts over the hills. Bill pulled on his boots and crossed the yard, the frost crunching underfoot. From the gate, he could see the lower field spread out before him, a pale mist hugging the grass. He was halfway across when he noticed the shape. At first he thought it was just a bundle of feed sacks, something left out the night before. But as he drew closer, the mist began to thin, and he saw the truth. One of the goats was lying there, perfectly still. No wound, no blood. Just the animal's eyes open to the sky, its body folded neatly into the earth as if it had lain down and never gotten up again. Bill knelt beside it, waiting for a breath that didn't come. The cold was sharp enough to sting his hands. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw another shape in the distance, and another beyond that. By the time he reached the far end of the field, 3 were dead. All the same, no marks, no sign of struggle. When he told Liz, she stood in the doorway, pale, arms folded tight across her chest. They buried the first that afternoon, but by the end of the week, more followed. The dogs grew nervous after that. They barked at nothing, their hackles up, staring into corners of the yard as though they could see something the family couldn't. Then one night, they started howling, a long, low sound that didn't stop until morning. And when the sun came up, one of them was gone too, found by the shed, stretched out, as lifeless as the goats had been. From that day on, the farm was different. The air hung heavy. The fields felt wrong. It was as if something unseen had taken an interest in their animals and was slowly working its way closer. To neighbors, it seemed uncanny, but to Liz and Bill, it felt like punishment. And still the phenomena inside the house continued. At night, running footsteps pounded along empty corridors. Doors slammed with violent force. Loud bangs echoed from rooms that no one entered. Objects shifted or fell without human touch. Guests described feeling watched by unseen eyes, a pressure that bore down on them the longer they stayed. It was then that Liz began to suspect that the silent old woman in the corner of the playroom was more than a ghost. She was the center. Some described her as gaunt, her face hard and unyielding. Others said her eyes were black and depthless. A figure cursed to linger in her own domain, feeding off the life of the household. Word of the haunting spread. Visitors came, psychics, spiritualists, curious investigators. One after another, they tried to explain what they felt. Some spoke of a violent man, long dead, whose cruelty tainted the house. Others insisted it was a victim's ghost replaying her agony. A dowser claimed the house sat on poisoned land, crossed by lines of malignant energy. Another psychic claimed there was an alchemist once tied to the soil, his work staining it with corruption. And then came the priests. Again and again, exorcisms were performed at Heol Fanog. Rituals were spoken, holy water sprinkled, prayers and banishments attempted. But if the house was cleansed, it did not last. The family would have a night or two of uneasy calm, and then the disturbances surged again, worse than before. Liz later said there were hundreds of exorcisms. Whether that number is exact or not, the point is clear. The house resisted every attempt to be purified. In folklore, that too is a hallmark of witchcraft. Witches were said to outlast prayers, to return after banishments, their curses clinging to the victim until the witch herself was destroyed. And so the family endured. Their money drained, their animals lost, their house filled with noise and shadows. The children grew up in a world where an old woman stood silently in their playroom and where the adults whispered about ghosts and curses. The most unsettling thought was not just that the house was haunted. It was that it was possessed. That the land itself had absorbed something malignant, an ancient residue of anger, cruelty, or witchcraft. And now, like the most enduring of curses, it would never let go. In Wales, stories of witches and wise women go back centuries. They are said to dwell in valleys, in lonely farmsteads, in cottages where strange lights burn at night. And in Heol Fanog, it seemed that one such figure had remained. No longer living, perhaps, but present all the same. Feeding on the rich family, watching silently, turning their dream farmhouse into a nightmare. By the early 1990s, the riches were at breaking point. Friends were reluctant to visit. The farm's reputation spread across the region. And behind every phenomenon, every bill, every death, every sleepless night, was the lingering suspicion that this was no ordinary haunting. This was the work of a witch. And Heol Fanog was now becoming infamous. Not just as a haunted farmhouse, but as a place cursed, hexed, and drained by the old woman in the corner. By the mid-1990s, the rich family were running on fumes. Heol Fanog had drained them of money, health, and hope. Liz herself claimed to have glimpsed the figure one night. It was late, past midnight, and the house was holding that kind of silence that only comes in the countryside. She couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, close, as though the house was breathing with her. She rose quietly so as not to wake Bill, padded down the hallway, and stopped at the kitchen sink. From there, the window looked out across the yard to the dark shape of the barn and the empty fields beyond. The glass had misted slightly with the cold. She rubbed it clear with her palm and froze. In the reflection, she saw her own face, and behind it, another. An old woman's face, pressed close to the other side of the glass. Pale skin and eyes black. Liz blinked, and for a heartbeat, the face seemed to stay exactly where it was. Then, slowly, it receded into the dark, not turning, not walking away, just fading, as though it had never been there at all. She later saw a photograph of a woman who had lived there before and said the resemblance was unmistakable. To her, the silent crone was not an anonymous spirit. She was someone tied to the land, to the stones of the house. When the first journalists came calling, it was not hard for them to seize on that image. Britain had many ghost stories, rattling chains, cold spots, fleeting shadows. But here was something darker, richer, almost medieval in its cruelty. Among locals, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of ley lines, of poisoned earth, of stones dragged from a ruined manor and graveyard to build the house. They spoke of energies that witches had once drawn. By the time the riches finally left the house, the legend was fully formed. Heol Fanog was no longer just their nightmare. It was a piece of modern folklore, a living echo of the witch stories that had haunted valleys and villages for centuries. But for the rich family, it was more than a story. And though they escaped the house, its reputation would follow them forever. And when a story like this takes root, people inevitably begin to ask, what was really happening in that lonely farmhouse? Some believe the answer is simple, that it was a curse. The old woman, the animals dropping dead, the electricity being consumed by something unseen. It all follows the patterns described in centuries of folklore. A witch doesn't need to speak, doesn't need to move. She only needs to remain silent and constant, her influence spreading through every part of the household. For those who lived through it, there could be no stronger explanation. But others say there was more than just one presence. That what Bill and Liz encountered was not a single witch, but a cluster of spirits bound to the land. An exorcist who visited the farmhouse spoke of 4 distinct entities: 2 young men, the old woman, and something darker still, a demonic force at the center of it all. If that's true, then Heol Fanog was less a cursed farm and more a crossroads, a place where multiple restless souls converged, feeding on the family's fear and misery. Of course, there are those who argue that the real source of the haunting wasn't spirit or witch, but the earth itself. Some say the farmhouse was rebuilt with stone taken from a ruined manor, even from a graveyard, carrying with it fragments of the dead. Others claim the site sits upon ley lines, the invisible tracks of power that crisscross the land. If that's true, then the riches were victims of poisoned ground, a place where energies older than memory continue to twist and surge, manifesting in terror. And then there are the skeptics. They suggest that all of it, the footsteps, the old woman, the endless drain of money, can be explained without curses. The house was damp and isolated. The family were under financial strain. Power surges and faulty wiring could have made the electricity readings impossible to decipher. The children, already living in a stressful, fearful environment, could have imagined the figure in the playroom. Once the idea of a haunting took hold, every creak, every dead animal, every misfortune fed the cycle of belief. In that telling, Heol Fanog was never cursed. It was simply a family unraveling under pressure, with folklore filling the cracks. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps there was something unusual at Heol Fanog, a haunting or a series of strange coincidences, which was then shaped by fear, suggestion, and the weight of centuries-old folklore. When the children saw an old woman, they didn't just see a ghost. They saw the figure every culture had taught them to fear, the witch in the corner of the room. And once that image took hold, the legend wrote itself. What is certain is that the story of the witch farm endures. It has been retold in newspapers, documentaries, and podcasts. People still visit the valley and look up at the house, wondering what happened inside. Some say the haunting was proof of witchcraft lingering into the modern world. Others call it mass hysteria. But everyone agrees, something at Heol Fanog changed those who lived there and left a scar deep enough to echo decades later. Heol Fanog still stands. The hills are the same, the wind still moves through the grass, and the house watches the valley the way it always has. Whatever claimed that house may have finally let go. Or perhaps it's simply waiting for someone else to move in.